Hello friends, welcome to the All-Father Chronicles. This is a story about a D-class person in the Scp Foundation. Mike had been in prison for what felt like an eternity, though in reality, it was only 10 years out of his life sentence. He was a man of simple pleasures, like not being in prison. So, when the opportunity came to leave the hellhole he called home, he took it without hesitation. There was just one small catch: he wasn't being transferred to another prison or released on good behavior. No, Mike was about to become something called Class D personnel for some shady organization he'd never heard of, the Scp Foundation. At first, Mike thought this might be some kind of government witness protection program. He had visions of sneaking out in the dead of night, hopping over fences, and vanishing into the sunset with a new identity. How hard could it be, he thought. But as the armored transport van rattled along, taking him to his new home, a sinking feeling began to settle in his gut. Something told him he wasn't going to like this new gig. The moment he arrived at Site 19, Mike knew this wasn't the easy escape route he'd imagined. The facility was vast and foreboding, filled with long, sterile hallways, guarded by men and women with more weapons than he'd ever seen in his life. They didn't look like the kind of people you wanted to mess with, and Mike, despite his criminal record, had always been one to pick his battles wisely. Mike and a few other unlucky souls were herded into a stark room where they were given the talk. A stern-looking man in a lab coat, who Mike mentally nicknamed Dr. Buzzkill, laid out the rules in a way that suggested he'd given this speech 1,000 times before. There was something in his eyes, maybe it was despair, maybe it was just deep-seated apathy, that made Mike think he might be the least of Dr. Buzzkill's concerns. Obedience: Class D personnel must follow all orders given to them by Foundation staff, without question. Violate this, and you'll regret it. Mike slouched in his chair, tuning out Dr. Buzzkill. Yeah, do what you're told, or you'll get slapped on the wrist or worse, he thought. He'd heard it all before, in prison, and he was still alive. But he couldn't help noticing that some of the other Class D folks were sweating bullets. This wasn't your average prison orientation. Confidentiality: you are prohibited from discussing any information about your experiences with the Foundation, both during and after your time here. Talk, and we'll make sure you never speak again. Mike smirked. Talk to who, he wondered. He didn't plan on making any friends here, let alone talking to them. After all, a quiet life was a long life. Cooperation: you must cooperate fully with any testing or procedures conducted by the Foundation. Testing? Procedures? Mike felt a tiny pang of doubt. Just what kind of procedures were they talking about? Compliance: you must comply with all safety protocols and procedures, including wearing protective gear and following specific instructions. Great, Mike thought sarcastically. They want us to wear lab coats and goggles like we're in some sci-fi movie. What next? We're going to fight aliens? Respect: you are expected to treat all Foundation staff with respect, regardless of their rank or position. Mike rolled his eyes. Respect wasn't something he gave easily, but if it kept him alive, he'd play along. But he couldn't shake the feeling that these rules were the least of his worries. Finally, Dr. Buzzkill concluded, violations of these rules can result in severe consequences, including physical punishment, solitary confinement, or even termination. The word termination hung in the air like a bad smell. Mike looked around. Nobody else seemed to be smiling anymore, either. The stakes had just been raised, and Mike was starting to realize that whatever was going on here, it was no joke. As they were led away to their quarters, Mike overheard some of the other Class D personnel whispering about the anomalies housed at the facility. A giant lizard that could regenerate, an old man who could create portals, and some kind of plague doctor that was as lethal as he was mysterious. They spoke in hushed tones, as if just mentioning these things would bring them down upon their heads. Mike had spent his life dismissing rumors and tall tales. After all, he'd grown up on the streets, where urban legends were as common as potholes. But this time, he felt a shiver run down his spine. Maybe there was something to the rumors. But hey, it wasn't like he had a choice, right? Mike's first day on the job was far from the janitorial work he'd expected. Sure, he was handed a mop and a bucket, but the room he was assigned to clean wasn't your standard prison cell. Oh no, it was a containment chamber, and inside it was something that looked like it belonged in a modern art museum, or a weird, humanoid statue made of concrete and rebar. The guards escorting him didn't seem too friendly, but that was nothing new. What got Mike's attention was how serious they were about the instructions. "Listen up, newbies," one of them barked. "This here is SCP-173. When you're cleaning this room, you do not, under any circumstances, take your eyes off it. You understand?" Mike nodded lazily, not really taking the warning to heart. It was a statue, for crying out loud. How dangerous could it be? The guard continued, "You'll be in there with 3 others. You take turns blinking. If anyone screws up, you'll all end up dead. Got it?" That got Mike's attention. He wasn't about to die on his first day at this place. As they were ushered into the room, Mike couldn't help but eye the statue skeptically. It was ugly, sure, like something a first-year art student might whip up after watching too many horror movies. But still, it was just a hunk of concrete, right? As they got to work, the atmosphere in the room grew tense. Mike kept glancing at the other D-class guys, waiting for someone to crack. Everyone was doing their job, but their eyes were wide, and their movements jerky, like they were expecting something to happen. Minutes dragged on, and Mike's eyes began to burn from not blinking. But he wasn't about to be the first to take a break. Then, one of the other guys, a nervous wreck with a twitch in his left eye, let out a small gasp. I think it moved," he stammered. Mike rolled his eyes. "It's a statue, man. You're just seeing things." But deep down, Mike was starting to feel uneasy. Maybe it was the atmosphere, or maybe it was the fact that the guards outside the room seemed way too interested in what was happening. Whatever it was, Mike couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. Finally, the cleaning job was done, and they were allowed to leave. Mike felt a wave of relief wash over him as he stepped out of the room. But as they walked away, he couldn't resist glancing back at SCP-173. For just a split second, he could have sworn he saw it leaning slightly to one side, as if it was watching him. Mike shook his head, trying to dispel the creepy thought. "Get a grip," he muttered to himself. "It's just a statue. Just a stupid, harmless statue." But the feeling of unease lingered long after he'd returned to his quarters. Over the next few days, Mike began to settle into the strange routine of life at Site-19. Most of his time was spent doing menial tasks, cleaning, fetching supplies, and generally trying to stay out of trouble. But the more he overheard from the other D-class personnel, the more he realized just how bizarre and dangerous this place really was. The rumors he'd heard on his first day were just the tip of the iceberg. There were stories about a giant, immortal reptile that couldn't be killed, no matter what they tried. There was talk of an old man who could walk through walls, dragging people into some kind of pocket dimension where they were never seen again. And then there was the plague doctor, a mysterious figure who claimed to be able to cure people, though nobody ever came back from one of his treatments. Mike tried to dismiss these tales as exaggerations or outright lies. But the nervous, haunted looks in the eyes of the other D-class personnel made it hard to shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, they were telling the truth. One evening, Mike found himself in the mess hall, trying to choke down the tasteless slop they served for dinner. He was joined by a fellow D-class, a wiry guy with a jittery demeanor named Jenkins. "Hey, Mike," Jenkins said in a low voice, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "You ever hear about SCP-096? Mike shook his head, more interested in his food than another horror story. "Now, what's the deal with it?" Jenkins leaned in closer, his eyes wide with fear. "They call it the shy guy. It's this skinny, humanoid thing, right? Looks like it's always crying, covering its face. But if you see its face, if you look at a picture, a video, or even just a drawing, it'll come after you. Doesn't matter where you are. It'll find you and, well, let's just say you won't be around to tell anyone about it." Mike snorted, trying to sound unimpressed, but the idea of a creature that could hunt you down from anywhere was deeply unsettling. "Sounds like a bad horror flick," he said, forcing a grin. "I'll pass." Jenkins didn't smile. "You laugh now, but you won't be laughing if you ever see it. They say it's unstoppable. No one's ever survived a run-in with 096. Mike went back to his meal, trying to push the disturbing thought out of his mind. But as the days went on, he found himself becoming more paranoid, constantly watching his back, always waiting for something to go wrong. Mike had always been a schemer. Back in prison, he'd pulled off a dozen small-time cons and scams. He'd managed to survive on his wits and charm, and even though this place was 100 times worse than any prison, he still had his old instincts. One night, as he lay on his cot, staring up at the ceiling, Mike started to hatch a plan. If he could somehow find a way out of this place, maybe, just maybe, he could escape and disappear. The thought of freedom was tantalizing, and it gave him something to focus on other than the constant fear that seemed to hang over Site-19 like a dark cloud. He started paying close attention to the layout of the facility, memorizing the routes he took during his daily tasks. He kept an eye on the guards, noting their patrol schedules and any potential weaknesses in security. It wasn't much, but it was a start. His plan was simple: wait for the right moment, find an unsecured exit, and make a break for it. Of course, there was the minor detail of the anomalies, but Mike figured he'd cross that bridge when he came to it. The opportunity came sooner than he expected. One afternoon, while cleaning a storage room, Mike noticed that the door to the maintenance tunnels had been left unlocked. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized this could be his chance. If he could slip into the tunnels and find a way out, he might actually pull this off. He hesitated for a moment, weighing the risks. But the thought of spending the rest of his life at Site-19 was too much to bear. Without looking back, Mike slipped through the door and into the dimly lit tunnels. For a while, everything seemed to be going smoothly. The tunnels were quiet, and Mike navigated them with surprising ease. He began to feel a flicker of hope: maybe he could actually do this. But as he rounded a corner, he suddenly froze. Standing in the middle of the tunnel was a massive, reptilian creature. It was easily 3 times the size of a man, with scales as thick as armor and eyes that glowed with an eerie, malevolent intelligence. Mike's heart sank as he realized he'd just run into SCP-682, this hard-to-destroy reptile that everyone had been whispering about. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Mike stared at the creature, his mind racing with panic. There was no way out. He was trapped. The creature let out a low, rumbling growl, and Mike knew he was done for. All his plans, all his schemes, none of it mattered anymore. He was about to become just another statistic, another poor soul lost to the horrors of Site-19. But then, something strange happened. Instead of attacking, SCP-682 simply stared at Mike, as if sizing him up. Then, with a dismissive snort, the creature turned and lumbered away into the darkness. Mike stood there, trembling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had it spared him? Or had he just been too insignificant for it to bother with? Whatever the reason, Mike wasn't about to stick around and find out. He turned and bolted back the way he'd come, his earlier dreams of escape shattered. As he burst back into the storage room, gasping for breath, Mike realized just how foolish he'd been. This place was a nightmare, and there was no escaping it. All he could do was survive as long as possible and hope for the best. After his failed escape attempt, Mike resigned himself to the fact that he was stuck at Site-19. The reality of his situation hit him like a ton of bricks, and he threw himself into his work with grim determination. If he couldn't escape, he might as well try to avoid getting killed. His next assignment was to clean the containment chamber of SCP-096, the creature Jenkins had warned him about. Mike's heart sank as he was handed the mop and bucket. Of all the jobs he could have been given, this was the one he feared most. He was joined by 2 other D-Class personnel, both of whom looked just as terrified as he felt. The guards outside the chamber gave them the usual warnings: don't look at the creature's face, don't make any sudden movements, and for the love of all that's holy, don't screw up. As they entered the chamber, Mike's hands shook. SCP-096 was crouched in the corner, its long, spindly limbs drawn up around its face. It looked pitiful, almost pathetic, until he remembered what it was capable of. The three of them got to work, scrubbing the floors and walls as quickly and quietly as possible. Mike kept his eyes down, avoiding any chance of accidentally seeing the creature's face. The tension in the room was palpable, and every minute felt like an eternity. But then, as they were finishing up, one of the other D-Class personnel made a fatal mistake. He glanced up, just for a split second, and caught a glimpse of SCP-096's face. Mike heard a low, guttural wail rising from the creature. His blood ran cold as he realized what was about to happen. Without thinking, he bolted for the door, the other D-Class right behind him. They didn't make it. As Mike reached the door, he heard the sound of tearing flesh and a scream that was abruptly cut off. He didn't stop to look back. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what had happened. He slammed the door shut behind him and collapsed against it, gasping for breath. The guards looked at him with a mix of pity and resignation. "Get back to your quarters," one of them said. "You're lucky to be alive." Mike didn't argue. He stumbled back to his quarters, his mind numb with shock. He'd come within inches of death, and it was only by sheer luck that he'd survived. As he lay on his cot that night, staring up at the ceiling, Mike couldn't shake the feeling that his luck was going to run out sooner rather than later. By now, Mike had seen enough to realize that the SCP Foundation was a whole new level of crazy. Every day was a new nightmare, and he was just trying to keep his head down and survive. But despite everything, he still had his old habit of running his mouth, especially when it came to giving advice, whether people wanted it or not. One day, while on cleaning duty in the break room, Mike overheard a couple of guards talking about SCP-173, the statue that only moved when no one was looking. They were discussing how to improve containment protocols, throwing around ideas that ranged from the practical to the downright ridiculous. Mike couldn't resist chiming in. "Hey, why don't you just put a bunch of mirrors in the room? That way, even when you're not looking directly at it, you can still see it, right?" The guards turned to look at him, clearly annoyed that a lowly D-Class was butting into their conversation. But Mike was on a roll. Or better yet, he continued, "Why not just slap a GoPro on its head? Stream it live to a bunch of monitors. That way, someone's always watching." One of the guards, a grizzled veteran with a scar across his cheek, raised an eyebrow. "And what happens when the power goes out? Or the cameras fail? Or someone accidentally switches the feed?" Mike shrugged. "Hey, I'm just saying, it's better than nothing. I mean, come on, you guys have all this fancy tech and you're still using human eyeballs to keep that thing in check? Seems kinda low tech, if you ask me." The guard snorted. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't about tech. This is about survival. There's a reason we do things the way we do. You start messing with the protocols, and people die." Mike raised his hands in surrender. All right, I get it. Just trying to help." But as he walked away, he couldn't help but feel like he had a point. The Foundation was full of geniuses, sure, but sometimes they seemed to overcomplicate things. Maybe all they needed was a little common sense. Of course, Mike wasn't about to volunteer for any more advice sessions. He'd learned his lesson: when you're in a place like Site-19, it's best to keep your head down and your mouth shut. Mike's next assignment was a real doozy, SCP-049, the Plague Doctor. This wasn't some run-of-the-mill creepy statue or shy humanoid. This was a straight-up, old-timey Plague Doctor, complete with the beaked mask and robes. The thing that made 049 so terrifying wasn't just his appearance, though, it was his obsession with curing people. As Mike was briefed on the task, he couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. He was supposed to help clean the containment chamber after one of 049's procedures. The patient, of course, hadn't survived. When they brought him to the chamber, Mike saw the aftermath of 049's work. The place was a mess: blood, surgical tools, and the remains of what used to be a person. Mike's stomach churned, but he forced himself to focus on the task at hand. The last thing he wanted was to attract 049's attention. But as they worked, SCP-049 himself entered the room. He glided in with that eerie, calm demeanor, his eyes hidden behind the lenses of his mask. Mike froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He'd heard the stories, how 049 believed himself to be some kind of savior, and how his cures were nothing more than death sentences. The plague doctor approached the corpse on the table, tilting his head as if studying his handiwork. Then he turned his attention to Mike and the other D-Class personnel. "You there," 049 said, his voice smooth and oddly soothing. "Are you in need of a cure?" Mike swallowed hard, trying to keep his cool. "No, thanks. I'm, feeling pretty healthy." 049 regarded him for a moment, as if weighing his words. Then, to Mike's immense relief, he turned away and focused on the corpse again. "You are fortunate," 049 said. "But beware, the pestilence is everywhere. It is my duty to cleanse it." Mike didn't respond. He just kept cleaning, praying that 049 would lose interest in him. After what felt like an eternity, the plague doctor finally left the room, leaving Mike and the others to finish their work in peace. When it was all over, Mike felt like he'd aged 10 years. He'd faced death in a dozen different ways since arriving at Site-19, but something about 049 got under his skin. It wasn't just the threat of death, it was the idea that this thing actually believed it was helping people. That was a special kind of crazy that Mike had never encountered before. As he walked back to his quarters, Mike couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, he'd be better off back in prison. At least there, the threats were straightforward, getting shanked in the yard or beaten in a brawl. But here, the dangers were beyond anything he'd ever imagined. And the worst part? He was starting to get the sinking feeling that there was no way out. Life at Site-19 had become a blur of terrifying encounters and soul-crushing monotony for Mike. Every day was the same: clean, avoid death, eat tasteless slop, and repeat. But amidst the chaos, he found solace in one small corner of the facility, the break room. The break room was a dingy little space with cracked tiles and flickering fluorescent lights, but it was the one place where Mike could relax, if only for a few minutes. It was here that the D-Class personnel gathered to swap stories, complain about their assignments, and generally try to forget the horrors they faced on a daily basis. One day, as Mike was nursing a cup of the worst coffee he'd ever tasted, he overheard a conversation that piqued his interest. "You ever notice how Jenkins has been acting weird lately?" one of the other D-Class said, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "Jenkins? That guy's always been a little off," another replied, chuckling. "No, I mean weirder than usual," the first guy insisted. "He's been talking about some kind of escape plan. Says he's found a way out of this place." Mike's ears perked up at the mention of an escape plan. He'd long since given up on the idea of getting out, but if someone else had a plan, maybe, just maybe, there was a chance. He waited until the others had left the break room, then cornered the guy who'd mentioned Jenkins. "Hey, what's this about an escape plan? You think he's serious?" The guy looked around nervously. "I don't know, man. Jenkins has always been a little unhinged, you know? But he swears he's found a way to get past security. Something about a maintenance tunnel that leads to an old, unused part of the facility." Mike's mind raced. He'd been down that road before, and it hadn't ended well. But the idea of escape was too tempting to ignore. "You know where I can find Jenkins?" The guy hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, he's usually cleaning in the lower levels this time of day. But be careful, Mike. If he's really planning something, and the guards find out." Yeah, I know," Mike said, already heading for the door. He'd take his chances. Anything was better than staying here. Mike tracked Jenkins down in one of the maintenance corridors, scrubbing the floor with a dirty mop. The man looked more paranoid than ever, constantly glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to sneak up on him. "Jenkins," Mike said, keeping his voice low. "I heard you've got a plan to get out of here." Jenkins flinched, then looked up at Mike with wild eyes. "Who told you that?" "Doesn't matter," Mike replied. "I'm interested. You think you can really get out?" Jenkins hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I've been working on this for months. There's an old tunnel, part of the original facility. They sealed it off years ago, but I found a way to reopen it. It leads to a forgotten exit, one they don't monitor anymore." Mike's heart pounded with excitement. This could be it, his ticket out of this nightmare. "And you're sure it's not guarded?" "As sure as I can be," Jenkins said. "But we've got to move fast. If the guards catch wind of this, we're dead." Mike didn't need any more convincing. He'd take his chances with the tunnel. "When do we go?" "Tonight," Jenkins whispered. "Meet me here after lights out." That night, Mike could hardly contain his anticipation. He lay in his cot, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the signal. When the lights finally went out, he slipped out of bed and made his way to the maintenance corridor. Jenkins was already there, nervously pacing back and forth. "You ready?" he asked as soon as he saw Mike. "Let's do it," Mike replied, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. They made their way through the maze of corridors, avoiding the occasional guard patrol. Jenkins led the way, moving with the caution of someone who knew the stakes were life and death. Finally, they reached the sealed-off section of the facility. The tunnel entrance was hidden behind a pile of old equipment, and it took both of them to shift the heavy crates and debris out of the way. "There," Jenkins said, pointing to a rusted metal door. "That's the way out." Mike grabbed the door handle and pulled with all his strength. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, narrow tunnel beyond. Jenkins handed Mike a flashlight, and they began their descent into the darkness. The air was musty and stale, and the walls were lined with ancient pipes and wiring. It felt like they were descending into the bowels of the earth. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the end of the tunnel. Ahead of them was another door, this one newer and more secure-looking. Jenkins fumbled with a set of keys, his hands shaking with excitement. "This is it," Jenkins said as he unlocked the door. "Freedom, man. We're almost there." But as the door swung open, Mike's heart sank. Instead of the outside world, they were staring at a small, dimly lit room filled with monitors and surveillance equipment. And standing in the center of the room was a stern-looking man in a lab coat, flanked by two heavily armed guards. "Going somewhere," the man said, raising an eyebrow. Jenkins froze, his face going pale. No, this isn't possible. I had it all planned out." Mike cursed under his breath. They'd walked right into a trap. The man in the lab coat sighed. "You D-class are all the same. Always trying to escape, always failing. When will you learn?" Mike clenched his fists, his mind racing for a way out. But there was no way out of this. They'd been caught red-handed. "Take them back to their quarters," the man ordered the guards. "We'll deal with them in the morning." As the guards marched them back through the tunnels, Mike couldn't help but feel a crushing sense of defeat. He'd thought he was smart, that he could outwit the Foundation. But in the end, he was just Ano. The next day, Mike and Jenkins were summoned to a disciplinary hearing. The man in the lab coat, who Mike now knew was Dr. Harrison, one of the site's senior staff, was waiting for them, along with a panel of other grim-faced officials. "D-Class Mike and D-Class Jenkins," Dr. Harrison began, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. "You stand accused of attempting to escape Site M19, a clear violation of Foundation protocol." Mike said nothing, his mind numb. He'd already accepted his fate. Whatever punishment they had in store for him, it couldn't be worse than the hell he'd already endured. Jenkins, on the other hand, was a wreck. He tried to explain, to plead for mercy, but his words fell on deaf ears. The panel had already made up their minds. "Due to the severity of your actions," Dr. Harrison continued, "you will be reassigned to more hazardous duties. Consider this a final warning." Mike's stomach turned. He knew what hazardous duties meant, handling the most dangerous SCPs, the ones that could kill you in an instant. It was a death sentence, just drawn out over time. The hearing was over in a matter of minutes. Mike and Jenkins were escorted back to their quarters, both of them silent and defeated. In the days that followed, they were given new assignments, each more dangerous than the last. Mike found himself dealing with SCPs he'd only heard about in whispered rumors, creatures and anomalies that defied logic and sanity. But through it all, Mike managed to survive. Barely. He became numb to the horrors, focusing only on the task at hand. Every day was a struggle, but he refused to give up. If there was one thing prison had taught him, it was how to survive against the odds. Jenkins wasn't so lucky. One day, he simply didn't return from his assignment. No one talked about it, and Mike didn't ask. He knew better than to ask. As time went on, Mike became a fixture at Site 19. The guards no longer looked at him with contempt, they saw him as a survivor, someone who could handle the worst the Foundation had to offer. And in a twisted way, Mike took pride in that. He'd outlasted them all, the other D-Class, the guards who came and went, even some of the SCPs themselves. But deep down, he knew it was only a matter of time before his luck ran out. No one survived Site 19 forever. Not even Mike. And so, he continued to live day by day, always on edge, always watching his back. Because in a place like Site 19, the only thing you could count on was that eventually, something would get you. Mike's life had become a never-ending cycle of fear and survival. But he was still standing, still breathing, and that was more than most could say. He'd seen countless others come and go, most of them meeting grisly ends, but somehow he'd managed to stay alive. But deep down, Mike knew that his luck would run out eventually. And one day, it finally did. It started like any other day at Site 19. Mike was assigned to assist with the containment of SCP-106, the Old Man, a sadistic, semi-corporeal entity that could pass through solid matter and drag its victims into a pocket dimension where time and space were meaningless. The procedure was supposed to be routine: lure 106 back into its containment cell using a D-Class as bait, then reseal the chamber. Mike had done it before, and while it was terrifying, he knew the drill. But this time, something went wrong. As they were executing the procedure, a containment breach alarm went off, signaling that another SCP had escaped. Chaos erupted as the guards and staff scrambled to contain the breach. In the confusion, SCP-106 broke free from its cell, its dark, oozing form slipping through the walls like a nightmare-made flesh. Mike and the other D-Class ran, but 106 was relentless. It moved with a terrifying speed, its skeletal hand reaching out to grab anyone it could. Mike knew that if 106 caught him, he was done for. There was no escape from the Old Man's pocket dimension. But as he sprinted down the corridor, dodging other fleeing personnel, Mike saw something that made his blood run cold. SCP-173, the statue that only moved when no one was looking, was standing at the end of the hall, its blank, concrete face staring straight at him. Mike was trapped between two of the most deadly SCPs in the facility, with no way out. He knew there was only one option left. Taking a deep breath, he ran towards 173, his eyes locked on the statue. As long as he kept looking at it, it couldn't move. Maybe, just maybe, he could slip past it and find a way to escape. But as he approached 173, he heard a sound that made his heart sink. It was the sound of footsteps, more D-Class, running for their lives. And they were about to round the corner, right into 173's line of sight. No! Mike shouted, but it was too late. The moment the other D-Class saw 173, they froze in terror. And in that split second, when no one was watching, the statue moved. There was a sickening crack as 173 snapped the neck of the nearest D-Class, then the next and the next. Mike tried to keep his eyes on the statue, but the chaos around him made it impossible. He knew that if he blinked, even for a moment, 173 would kill him too. But before he could react, SCP-106 reached him. Its skeletal hand clamped down on his shoulder, and Mike felt a cold, slimy sensation as the Old Man began to drag him into the floor. Mike struggled, kicking and screaming, but it was no use. He was being pulled into 106 pocket dimension, where the rules of reality no longer applied. As he was dragged down into the darkness, Mike's last thought was that he had finally run out of luck. There was no escape from this. No more schemes, no more plans. Just endless, eternal torment. And then, there was nothing.